Hello, this is Taylor, and this is my final exam presentation for our wildlife biology class. I would just like to start out by saying I enjoyed this class so much, and I hope this presentation does a good job of summing up some of the things that we've been able to cover in our second half of the semester. So let's get right into it. So starting off with our behavioral ecology lecture by Dr. Marissa, this was one of the most interesting lectures that we were able to learn about, in my opinion, just because of the uniqueness of the species and the uniqueness of the type of research that was being conducted. But to start out, the main findings that Dr. Marissa was able to conclude included the territory boundary patrols, testosterone levels, the boundary patrolling, hunting and meat sharing testosterone levels, and then same things for the cortisol levels. But to start out, the territorial boundary patrols, this is where the testosterone was actually elevated beforehand and after the boundary patrol as well, while the cortisol was only raised mainly afterwards, which was unusual because originally it was thought that the testosterone level would not be elevated beforehand. And then for hunting, testosterone was also raised beforehand, but oddly enough, not afterwards, which was an interesting finding. And then cortisol was actually the exact opposite. So the cortisol was raised afterwards. And one of the reasons that could have been presented for this was that the testosterone was no longer needed after the hunt was over, and the chimpanzees will actually forage together, so their testosterone level will drop because they're engaging in more of a social behavior between them. So then moving on to meat sharing, kind of like I just mentioned, the testosterone levels decrease following meat sharing, which is very significant because it is a very personal and overall just sharing between the two. So that would be one of the reasons that the testosterone level would actually drop. The relationship between endocrine hormones and urine is actually very important for this study as well, in the sense that the steroid hormones usually take about 2 hours to shed in the urine. So the samples were collected at that time, and if they were increased in the urine, this also means that they were increased in the body. So being able to analyze the urine is a very good indicator of what the cortisol levels look like in the chimpanzees. And another way to do this is actually by drawing blood, but in a case like this, it would be very hard to take all the chimpanzees and draw their blood every time you needed to examine the cortisol level or the testosterone level. So being able to do this with urine is very helpful. And then lastly, what the hormones can signify in the chimpanzee's behavior is several different things. The first is that cortisol is not necessarily an indicator of dominance, since all over the dominance hierarchy in the results, there was varying levels of cortisol. And this can be due to several different things, but the environmental factors are some of the most important things. For example, if it's overly hot outside or it's raining outside or just the weather is off, the stress levels are going to be up because their environment is harder to live in and maintain themselves in. And then another cortisol producer is actually receiving aggression, which totally makes sense. If somebody was coming at me in an aggressive way, I would definitely be stressed out as well. So that is definitely a good indicator of cortisol level. And then same thing for testosterone levels. This can actually reflect the fitness of muscle mass, reproductive success, foraging together can also be decreased. Testosterone levels can be decreased whilst foraging together. So there's a few different things that testosterone can be influenced by, but that's just kind of an overview of how the hormones can signify different things in the chimpanzee's behavior. But overall, this was an extremely interesting study and something that was very nice to be able to learn about. Moving on to the shiny cowbirds, kind of a bit of a species jump here. These guys are a geographic range of mostly South America. And this purple map here that my head is directly covering is kind of their largest range where they will live all year. Now their migration patterns will change this map just a little bit, same with their reproductive patterns when they decide to move around to mate. But for the majority of the time, they're in this purple range here in South America. And this map is actually from the Cornell lab here. And then as far as host species goes, these guys are kind of special because they are host generalists. They do not discriminate on their host, and actually up to 176 hosts of different birds has been chosen for these guys, which allows all different types of nests to be used. And so a unique adaptation is that they will actually go into these nests and they will poach the eggs that are currently in there. So when they are putting their eggs in order to take over that nest, then they will eliminate any eggs that are there previously. And then another unique thing that they do is the males actually have a playing dead behavior, which helps them get close to the host nest so they do not look like a threat when they are approaching the nest. And then once they get close to the nest, then they will swap out their own eggs for the eggs that are currently there. So that's just kind of something interesting. This adaptation has really helped them to increase their population because they are able to use so many different types of nests, since they have up to 176 that they can choose from. And they also just have a very unique way of swapping out the eggs. But this does bring some conservation issues, of course, because the shiny cowbirds themselves don't currently face any conservation issues, but they are a causative agent of conservation issues. They have actually put 5 different bird species on the endangered species list due to their poaching habits. This is because when they take their eggs that are not theirs out of the nest that they are choosing to be a parasite of, basically, they will decrease the population of that species because then that species who have put in time and effort to make their own babies, those babies are now gone. So this is definitely a problem for different types of species that are already endangered, and then especially because if they are already having issues, this just exacerbates the problem. So most of these species that I'm talking about now are passerine species. They're really, really pretty birds. I don't know much about birds, so learning about this was definitely very interesting to me. But the passerine species can range from a lot of different colors, and they're just really beautiful birds all around. But surprisingly, management of this phenomenon is very controversial because on the one hand, people are very concerned with the decline in the passerine species, which as they should be. But on the other hand, it is an evolutionary benefit to the cowbirds to do this behavior. So it's very hard to manage this because you don't want to hurt one species over the other, but you also want to make sure that the endangered species don't become more endangered. So there's definitely a lot of differing opinions on how to manage this successfully, which makes the situation pretty tough all around. And then the sources for this information comes from the Cornell Bird Lab, the University of California Press, and the Oxford Academic, Alrighty, so moving on to parental care. This was actually one of the articles that I was able to choose as far as this class goes. So this was a very near and dear slide to my heart, just because of the parental care that I had already learned about earlier in the semester. But these guys in particular, the African wild dogs, are very unique because the African wild dog male will actually provide for the family by regurgitating food for its puppies, protecting its puppies, especially when the mother is away. They will teach them how to hunt, and they will even protect the mothers of the pack. And so these guys are very unique because, like mentioned in the lecture, there are a lot of species, especially in the mammal category, that the mom does all of the work for protecting the offspring. So these guys are a bit different because the dad chips in, and not only does he chip in, he helps provide nutrition, which is very interesting and pretty rare. He also helps provide protections. So there's, of course, several evolutionary benefits to this because there's more protection for the offspring and the mothers. And then the puppies can actually learn how to hunt faster because they have more resources in order to gain that knowledge of hunting. And then it will also protect the size of the packs themselves. A specific paper where this can be seen is actually adoption as a conservation tool for endangered African wild dogs. And in this species, adoption is termed by multiple different things. The first one being the dad will adopt the puppies from the mom for an amount of time and take care of them while he's by himself. But this also means adoption in the traditional sense, where pups from other packs or abandoned puppies, things like that, can be adopted by the mom and dad of the other pack and treated like their own puppy. So this study took place in Botswana. One of the ways that these guys were studied was actually on a case-by-case basis. So there were several different families of the African wild dogs that were observed, and then information was collected about those. So this was an observational study, and the puppies were studied based on adoption practices and survivability. So basically how many puppies were adopted, if the puppy that was adopted survived, and that sort of thing. And what they found is that the more pups the pack had, the higher the chance of survival was for that pack, which makes sense because the more offspring we have, the more chance we have of continuing the line. But the other thing that was very interesting to note was that this actually increased genetic variability because, again, you were having puppies from different litters come into the original litter, and then they were able to increase genetic variability that way. But it's just a very interesting study because it was able to define the fact that the dads pitching in for the parental care was very important and was actually able to help the survivability of the puppies in general, and even through adoption, even if it wasn't their own puppy. So that was really neat. And then lastly, how can human behavior be impacted by identity? So for the human behavior section of this, I wanted to go over a study that actually looked at identity of humans and how that can impact the way that we behave throughout the day and how we interact with each other. And so how can a person how can a person's identity impact their behaviors? Many studies have been conducted on this before, but it's really tough to compare findings because identity can be described in so many different ways. When you think about, what identifies you as a person, it can be anything. It can be race, gender, age, what school you go to, anything, where you're from. All your background information can influence your identity. And so identity can also influence human behaviors, whether that be how we talk, how we dress, who we have social bonds with, our culture, all sorts of different things. And so the main findings of this study actually was that identity influences behavior indirectly. And so this is on a subconscious level because our identity will strengthen a person's intentions, which will then influence their behaviors. So it's tough to say for sure that a person's identity will impact their behavior, but this is the way that this study kind of was able to define it. And so my paper was selected because identity is something that a lot of people struggle with, especially when you're young or you're still in school, or even when you're older and you're kind of not sure, who you are, maybe you've lost your identity. And so I just wanted to point out this paper as a nod to that. And this came from the International Journal of Theory and Research. And then up here, last thing I've just got is on this table. So the way that they did this behavioral study is they actually took a bunch of different databases and combined them into one. And so this up here is how they actually chose which studies to use and which to not use. But anyways, that's just kind of a little bit of human behavior for you. And then here is my works cited. Thank you so much.